James Bennett was the kind of man who seemed to have everything under control. At just 42, he had built a successful business empire from the ground up, transforming a modest startup into one of the most reputable firms in the city. His life mirrored the perfect picture of success: a beautiful home, a loving family, and a business partner he trusted as much as he trusted himself. Alex Matthews had been by James's side for over a decade, helping him navigate the stormy waters of entrepreneurship. They were more than just partners, they were friends, bonded by years of shared success and mutual trust. For James, Alex's loyalty was unquestionable. Every morning, James walked into Marla's diner, a cozy corner spot where he and Alex often met to discuss business. The atmosphere of the diner was calm, its simplicity a comforting contrast to the high-stakes world they inhabited. There was something reassuring about the routine, the way the clink of ceramic mugs and the hum of low conversation felt so ordinary in the backdrop of their otherwise extraordinary lives. Emily worked at Marla's. A waitress in her mid-20s, she had spent the last few years serving tables and smiling through long shifts. To most people, she was simply part of the background, a kind but unremarkable face who brought coffee and sandwiches to their table. But Emily was far from ordinary. She was sharp, perceptive, and ambitious, though life had put a few detours in her path. She harbored quiet dreams of going back to school, of stepping away from the diner and into a new life. But for now, she was content enough, tending to customers like James and Alex, grateful for steady work and a place in the world. It was in these unassuming settings, familiar, predictable, safe, that the seeds of change were quietly sown. One evening, the diner was quieter than usual. It was late, and Emily was working the last shift of the day, clearing tables while the few remaining patrons sipped their drinks or picked at their meals. James and Alex were seated at their usual booth in the corner, papers scattered across the table as they discussed business. Emily had grown accustomed to their meetings, their hushed voices blending into the background noise of the diner. But tonight was different. As she approached their table to refill their coffee cups, Emily overheard something that made her pause. Alex's voice was low, but there was a tension to it that caught her attention. He was speaking to a man who had just joined them, a stranger Emily didn't recognize. The tone of the conversation shifted from business as usual to something far more sinister. "We've waited long enough," Alex muttered, leaning closer to the stranger. "It's time to start moving the money. James is clueless, still trusting me with every decision. If we keep stalling, someone else might notice the discrepancies in the accounts." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was Alex really talking about stealing from James? She hovered nearby, careful not to draw attention as she listened in. The stranger, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "And when the whole thing collapses? James will be left holding the bag," Alex said flatly. "It'll look like he was the one mismanaging the funds. I've covered my tracks. By the time anyone figures out what's happened, we'll be long gone." Emily's hands trembled as she walked away from the table, her mind racing. She had always seen Alex as the charming, confident partner, a perfect match to James's more serious demeanor. But now, the friendly mask had slipped, revealing a calculated and cold-hearted side she had never imagined. As she returned to the counter, Emily was faced with a profound moral dilemma. What was she supposed to do with this information? If she told James what she had heard, she could be putting herself at risk. Alex clearly had no qualms about betraying the person closest to him. What would he do to a waitress who overheard too much? She was just a nobody in his world, easily brushed aside. But how could she stay silent? She knew the right thing to do, but fear gripped her. James was a powerful man, and Alex even more so. Getting involved meant stepping into a world of power and money that was far removed from her own simple life. It was a dangerous game, and she wasn't sure she was ready to play. For the rest of her shift, Emily's thoughts churned with indecision. She replayed the conversation in her mind, feeling the weight of the responsibility fall heavier on her shoulders with each passing minute. She had no proof, just her word against Alex's. Would James even believe her? Would anyone believe her? By the time her shift ended, Emily had made up her mind. She couldn't stay silent, not when someone's entire life was at stake. The next day, she would approach James and tell him everything, no matter the risk. The next morning, Emily arrived at the diner earlier than usual, her nerves frayed from a sleepless night of anxiety. She rehearsed the conversation in her mind, trying to find the right words to explain what she had overheard. But every scenario ended the same way, James dismissing her, or worse, Alex discovering her involvement and retaliating. Still, she knew she had to follow through with her decision. It wasn't long before James walked in. As always, he looked composed, his neatly pressed suit and calm demeanor exuding the confidence of a man in control of his world. He greeted Emily with a polite nod as he took his usual seat. She hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath before making her way over to him. "Mr. Bennett," she began softly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. "There's something I need to tell you. Something important." James glanced up from his phone, looking mildly surprised but not alarmed. "What is it, Emily?" She fidgeted with the edge of her apron, unsure of how to start. "It's about Alex and your business. Last night, I overheard something when you two were talking. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but—" James raised a hand, cutting her off gently. "Emily, if this is about a misunderstanding, I appreciate your concern, but—" "No, you don't understand," she interrupted, her voice gaining urgency. "I heard Alex talking to someone about stealing money from your company. He said you wouldn't notice until it was too late, that he's been covering his tracks for a while now. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear I'm telling the truth." James's expression shifted, his polite smile fading as he processed what she was saying. He stared at her for a moment, then shook his head, his skepticism evident. "Emily, I've known Alex for over a decade. He's my closest friend, my business partner. There's no way he would do something like that. You must have misunderstood." "No, I didn't," Emily insisted, her heart sinking as she realized he wasn't going to believe her. "I know it's hard to accept, but I'm telling you, he's planning something, and you need to be careful." James leaned back in his seat, his expression softening with sympathy. "I appreciate your concern, but I trust Alex. He's been with me through everything. You don't have to worry about this." Emily stood there, feeling helpless. She could see it in his eyes. James wasn't just dismissing her. He couldn't fathom the idea that Alex, the person he trusted most, could betray him. It wasn't just skepticism. It was denial, the kind that came from a deep, unshakable bond. "Please," she said quietly, "just be careful." James nodded, offering her a reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I will, Emily. Thank you." As she walked away, her heart ached with frustration. She had done what she could, but it wasn't enough. James wouldn't act on a waitress's word, and without more concrete evidence, her warning would go unheard. That evening, as she lay awake in her small apartment, the weight of what she had witnessed pressed down on her again. She knew she couldn't just let it go. If James wasn't going to believe her, she would have to find a way to prove it. The decision ignited something within her. Fear still lingered, but so did a growing sense of purpose. She wasn't going to let Alex destroy someone's life without a fight. Over the following days, Emily began her own quiet investigation. Whenever Alex and James met at the diner, she paid closer attention, picking up on details she had once ignored. Alex's occasional phone calls outside the diner, his late-night meetings with the same stranger, the way his demeanor shifted when he thought no one was watching. Emily started taking notes, documenting anything that seemed suspicious. It was a risky move. She knew if Alex caught on, it could mean trouble for her, but the more she uncovered, the more determined she became. With each passing day, her confidence grew. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. Blending into the background, she was someone who had the power to make a difference. Meanwhile, James started noticing small discrepancies in his company's finances, a few missing invoices here, an unexplained transaction there. At first, he dismissed them as clerical errors, but a nagging feeling began to stir. He remembered Emily's warning, though he still found it hard to believe. Yet, the more these oddities piled up, the more uneasy he became. Could she have been right? James began reviewing the accounts more closely, searching for patterns. He told himself it was just a precaution, a way to settle the uncomfortable feeling in his gut. But as the days passed, what he found only deepened his suspicion. Something wasn't adding up, and the more he dug, the more he realized that someone had been tampering with the company's financials. His trust in Alex wavered for the first time in years. At the same time, Emily's efforts intensified. She followed Alex discreetly after work, noting his meetings with the stranger and other figures who seemed out of place. She recorded conversations when she could, capturing fragments of dialogue that hinted at something larger. Her nerves were frayed, but her resolve was unshakable. She was no longer the passive observer. She was in this, fully committed to exposing the truth. James, now gripped by suspicion, finally confronted the possibility that Emily might have been right all along. His denial cracked, and in its place, a growing sense of betrayal took root. He reached out to a private investigator, determined to get to the bottom of it. But Alex, sensing that something was amiss, began accelerating his plans, putting everything James held dear at risk. With Emily's growing collection of evidence and James's rising suspicions, the stakes were higher than ever. What had once seemed like an impossible scenario now felt all too real. James, still reluctant to fully accept that his closest friend could betray him, hired a private investigator to delve deeper into the company's financial inconsistencies. The investigator's findings, though early, pointed to one unsettling conclusion: money had been siphoned from the business for months, maybe even years. The slow trickle of missing funds that James had chalked up to minor errors was now revealed to be part of a much larger and meticulously crafted scheme. Meanwhile, Alex, always the calculating figure, had sensed a shift. He noticed the way James had started scrutinizing the accounts more closely and had seen the quiet tension in their meetings. But more than anything, Alex could tell something had changed in the way James looked at him. There was doubt now, suspicion lurking behind those once trusting eyes. It was enough for Alex to know that his window of opportunity was closing, and fast. Emily, too, felt the pressure mounting. She had followed Alex several nights in a row, documenting his meetings and quietly recording what she could. Each night, her nerves were tested. What if she was seen? What if Alex realized someone was tailing him? But her fear was outweighed by the conviction that she couldn't turn back now. She was in too deep. Her recordings were patchy, but they were enough to confirm that Alex was deep into something criminal. When James received the first detailed report from the investigator, it hit him like a tidal wave. The man he had trusted with everything, his business, his livelihood, his family's future, was at the center of a well-orchestrated plan to drain the company dry. The report laid out the timeline of Alex's actions, beginning with small, unnoticeable diversions of funds and escalating to more significant amounts over the past year. It was all there in black and white, a betrayal meticulously hidden behind years of friendship. For James, the realization was crushing. He felt a deep sense of anger, but also shame. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let his trust in Alex cloud his judgment for so long? As much as it hurt, James knew what had to be done. The evidence was overwhelming, and Alex's betrayal was undeniable. But Alex, ever the tactician, had already begun moving faster. He had shifted large sums of money out of the company's accounts in recent weeks, leaving the business teetering on the edge of collapse. If James didn't act soon, it would be too late to save everything he had built. That night, Emily gathered her courage and approached James once more. She had new recordings, clearer ones this time, of Alex discussing his plans. She played one of the recordings for James, and the raw truth in Alex's voice, as he casually talked about James's impending downfall, cut through whatever doubt remained in him. James looked at Emily, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief in his eyes. "You were right," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have listened to you sooner." Emily shook her head. "It's not your fault. People like Alex, they know how to hide who they really are." James sat in silence for a moment, absorbing everything. His world was unraveling, but amidst the chaos, he found a strange sense of clarity. The truth, as devastating as it was, had finally come into the light, and now he knew what had to be done. Together, James and Emily put their plan into motion. James moved quickly to protect his assets, quietly diverting what funds he could to safe accounts while he worked with the investigator to build a case against Alex. But Alex, realizing that the noose was tightening, started taking drastic measures. He withdrew as much as possible from the company's accounts and even began selling off company assets behind James's back, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. The tension was at its peak. Every move James made felt like a race against time. The investigation was underway, but Alex was one step ahead, putting everything James had at risk, including his family's future. Emily, now fully involved in the investigation, provided crucial information that helped James stay ahead of Alex's escalating schemes. Her bravery and resourcefulness had transformed her from a quiet observer into an essential ally. For James, the pain of Alex's betrayal ran deep, but it was tempered by a newfound respect for Emily. She had stepped into a dangerous situation, risking her own safety to help him uncover the truth. He had never expected to find an ally in someone like her, a waitress from the diner, a person he had once barely noticed. Yet now, she was the one standing beside him as his world threatened to crumble. The tipping point came when James learned that Alex had been planning his escape. He had funneled the last of the stolen funds into offshore accounts and was preparing to leave the country before the authorities could catch up with him. If James didn't act now, everything would be lost. The day of reckoning came sooner than expected. James had been working furiously with the private investigator and his legal team to build a case against Alex, but time was running out. The moment of confrontation could no longer be delayed. A high-stakes business meeting was arranged, one that Alex believed was a final opportunity to wrap up some last-minute deals before his planned departure. What he didn't know was that James had a very different agenda for that meeting. The room was tense when Alex arrived, unsuspecting of the trap that had been set. The board members gathered around the long table, James seated at the head. There was an air of formality in the room, but beneath it lay a quiet storm. Alex, ever the charismatic businessman, entered with his usual confident smile, greeting everyone with the ease of someone who believed he was still in control. He had no reason to suspect that his carefully laid plans were about to unravel. James's face, however, was unreadable. There was no warmth in his eyes, no friendly exchange of pleasantries as there had been in the past. Alex noticed this shift, his smile faltering slightly, but he pressed on. He had a part to play, and he was going to see it through. As the meeting got underway, the usual business reports were discussed. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, in the midst of routine conversations, James spoke up, his voice cutting through the room with a weight that silenced everyone. "Alex," James began, his tone steady but laced with barely contained anger. "There's something we need to address, something I've recently become aware of." Alex raised an eyebrow, feigning ignorance. "Of course, James. What's on your mind?" James leaned forward, his eyes locked on Alex. "For the last few months, I've noticed some significant discrepancies in the company's finances. Missing funds, unexplained transactions. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe an error in the accounting. But after some thorough investigation, it's become clear that this was no mistake." The room grew still. Alex shifted in his seat, but he maintained his composure, though the edges of his mask were starting to crack. "I'm not sure I follow, James. Are you suggesting there's been some sort of theft?" James's eyes narrowed. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating a fact." He nodded to the private investigator, who slid a stack of documents across the table. "These are the records, bank transfers, invoices, and a timeline that traces back several years. They all lead to you, Alex." A murmur ran through the room, the board members exchanging uneasy glances. Alex glanced down at the papers, his expression unreadable for a moment before he looked back up at James. He was still calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Panic, perhaps. "You can't be serious," Alex said, his voice still smooth, but with an undercurrent of tension. "James, we've known each other for over a decade. We've built this company together. Why would I steal from you? This has to be some sort of mistake." James didn't blink. "There's no mistake. The evidence is irrefutable." Alex hesitated for a second, calculating his next move. His mind raced through the possibilities. He could try to play innocent, continue to deny everything, or he could shift the blame. After all, James had been the one overseeing the financials all this time. Perhaps he could twist the narrative and frame this as James's failure to manage the company properly. Just as Alex opened his mouth to speak, Emily stepped forward from where she had been standing quietly in the back of the room. She had been observing the meeting, a silent witness to the unfolding drama, but now was her moment to reveal the final piece of the puzzle. "I think you'll want to hear this before you go any further, Alex," Emily said, her voice steady but firm. All eyes turned to her. Alex's face paled slightly, the confidence in his expression finally faltering as Emily pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen, and the room was suddenly filled with the sound of a recorded conversation, the one where Alex had discussed his plan to siphon money from the company and frame James for the financial collapse. His voice was unmistakable, clear and cold, as he outlined his betrayal to his accomplice. The room fell into a stunned silence. There was no denying it now. The recording was damning, and Alex knew it. He sat frozen, his face drained of color as the realization hit him. His carefully constructed scheme had just collapsed in front of his eyes. James stood up, his gaze fixed on Alex. "You've been planning this for years, haven't you?" His voice was low, filled with a quiet rage. "Using our friendship, our trust, to slowly bleed this company dry while I looked the other way. And all the while, you thought I'd never catch on." Alex's composure shattered. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back as he glared at James and Emily. "You don't understand," he hissed. "I had no choice. Do you think I wanted to do this? I've been drowning for years, watching as everything I built slipped through my fingers. You," he pointed a shaking finger at James. "You were always the one everyone looked up to. You had the perfect family, the perfect life. I was just trying to survive." James shook his head, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You could have come to me, Alex. You could have asked for help. But instead, you chose to betray everything we built together." Alex's desperation spilled over. "Survive? You have no idea what it's like to be on the edge, to watch everything you've worked for fall apart. I did what I had to do. But it was over." The evidence was undeniable, and Alex's frantic attempts to justify his actions only dug the hole deeper. Authorities, who had been briefed on the situation, arrived shortly after, and Alex was taken into custody. He tried one last time to manipulate the situation, pleading for leniency, claiming he had been forced into this by circumstances beyond his control. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. As Alex was led out of the room, the weight of his betrayal finally settled over James. It wasn't just the business that had been at stake, it was the years of trust, the friendship that had once meant everything to him. But there was no going back now. The truth had come to light, and Alex's downfall was complete. In that moment, James realized how much he had changed. He had started this journey believing he could control everything, that his judgment was infallible. But this ordeal had humbled him, teaching him the painful lesson that trust must be earned, not given blindly. Emily, standing by his side, had been the key to uncovering the truth. Her courage, her willingness to stand up against corruption, had saved him from losing everything. And in the end, it wasn't just her actions that had changed the course of events. It was the bond they had formed through the shared fight against betrayal. In the days that followed Alex's arrest, James's life gradually began to stabilize. The company was still in recovery mode, and the damage caused by Alex's betrayal would take time to fully mend. There were sleepless nights ahead and countless meetings with lawyers, accountants, and board members, but the immediate crisis had passed. The business had been saved, and most importantly, James's family was secure. For James, the experience had been transformative. He had always been a man who prided himself on his ability to judge character, to see the world in clear terms. But Alex's betrayal shattered that illusion. Trust, he realized now, wasn't just about length of friendship or shared history. It had to be tested, earned, and constantly nurtured. He had learned this lesson the hard way, and it was a humbling realization. Despite the challenges ahead, James felt a new sense of clarity about his life. He no longer felt the need to project an image of control and perfection. Instead, he embraced the vulnerability that came with acknowledging his mistakes. He had been wrong to trust Alex so blindly, and admitting that had freed him from the burden of his own pride. It also opened his eyes to those around him, people he had once overlooked or underestimated. Emily was one of those people. Her bravery, determination, and moral compass had been the driving force behind uncovering the truth. She hadn't needed to get involved. She could have turned a blind eye and avoided the risk. But she had chosen to act, and her decision had changed everything. In the end, it was Emily's courage that saved James, not just from financial ruin, but from losing faith in his own judgment and in the goodness of people. One afternoon, James invited Emily to his office. The tension of the last few weeks had passed, replaced by a quiet sense of gratitude that hung in the air. As she entered, she looked around, still slightly out of place in the world of boardrooms and business suits, but she carried herself with newfound confidence. "Emily," James began, standing up to greet her, "I wanted to thank you again. What you did, I don't think I can ever fully express how much it means to me and my family." Emily smiled, a modest blush coloring her cheeks. "I just did what I thought was right. Anyone would have done the same." James shook his head. "No, not everyone would have. You took a huge risk, and you didn't have to. You changed everything." There was a pause, and then James cleared his throat, reaching for a folder on his desk. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me, about your dream of going back to school. You have so much potential, and I want to help you fulfill it." He slid the folder across the desk to her. Confused, Emily opened it and found a letter inside, a scholarship offer in her name, fully funded by James's company. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she read through the details. "I've set up a fund for you," James explained. "It's enough to cover your tuition, books, whatever you need. It's not just a reward for what you did. It's because I believe in you, Emily. You have the intelligence, the integrity, and the drive to do anything you want. You deserve this." Emily stared at the letter, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know what to say. I never expected." "You don't have to say anything," James interrupted gently. "You've earned this. Consider it a thank you from me, but also an investment in your future. You've got something special, Emily, and the world deserves to see it." Overwhelmed, Emily nodded, a tear escaping down her cheek. For so long, she had doubted whether her dreams were even possible. Working long hours at the diner, feeling stuck, it had been easy to push those ambitions aside. But now, thanks to James, the door to her future had been opened wide. As she left James's office, holding the scholarship offer in her hand, Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She was no longer just the waitress from Marla's diner, living paycheck to paycheck. She was someone who had made a difference, someone who had stood up for what was right, even when it had been hard. And now, she had the chance to build a new life, one where she could pursue her education, follow her passions, and create the future she had always dreamed of. For James, the end of this ordeal was not just about putting the pieces of his business back together. It was about reevaluating what truly mattered. He had spent years thinking success was about building his empire, about control and power. But now he realized it was the people around him who made all the difference, the ones who stood by him when things fell apart, the ones who showed their true character when it mattered most. As Emily walked out of his office and back into the world, James knew that both of their lives had been changed forever. She would go on to pursue her dreams, just as he would continue to rebuild his life and business with a new perspective. The bond they had formed through this experience was one born out of adversity and trust, and though their lives would now take different paths, they would both carry with them the lessons they had learned. The story didn't end with a simple resolution. Instead, it marked a beginning, one where both James and Emily could move forward, stronger for what they had endured. James, more discerning and humble, had learned the value of vulnerability and the importance of trusting the right people. Emily, once a quiet observer, was now empowered to shape her own destiny. And in the end, it wasn't just a family that had been saved. It was the spirit of resilience, courage, and integrity that had triumphed, leaving both of them ready to embrace the future, forever changed by the experience.